The Art of Living with Idiots, Bukowski. There are people who don't just pass through your life like a brief rain shower. They stick like a damp stain on the wall that never fades. Bukowski knew them. He ran into them in the postal hallways, in the smoky bars of Los Angeles, in cheap apartments with thin walls. They wore uniforms, or suits, or just that smug little grin that was nothing more than a disguise for emptiness. They are a constant in life, like gravity or alcohol, unavoidable, whether you like them or not. They showed up in his life like bad actors in a movie he never ordered, and they stayed until the credits rolled. Supervisors at the post office who'd tell you how to hold an envelope as if it were an art form. Co-workers who warned you not to work too fast because it made them feel pressured. And those self-appointed philosophers at the bar who tried to explain life while they couldn't even pay their own tab. For Bukowski, they weren't just annoying. They were raw material. He knew that any one of these people could end up as a character in a story. Sometimes, he'd come home after a shift, close the door, and sit in the dark without turning on the light. Just him, a bottle, and the city noise outside. He'd think about that coworker who once told him with a straight face that you shouldn't work too fast at the post office because it messed with the rhythm. Or the supervisor who chewed him out for being 5 minutes late while disappearing himself for half an hour in the bathroom. Or that guy at the bar the night before who knew everything without ever having lived anything. Bukowski knew. Life delivers your idiots free of charge. All you have to do is take notes. He didn't see himself as a martyr. Life was a dirty business, and the only way to survive it was to keep yourself out of other people's hands as much as possible. Work was never more than a necessary evil, a way to keep drinking, writing, and breathing. The idiots. He couldn't get rid of them, but he could keep them at arm's length by giving them the same value as a cigarette butt in the gutter. Some evenings, he'd boil the day's most grotesque moments down into a few dry lines, so dry you didn't know whether to laugh or cry.
There were mornings when he knew from the start he didn't want a bite of that day. He'd walk into the post office, put on the work jacket, and there he was, the first guy who had to talk. Usually some man dreaming of a promotion that would never come, inventing his own authority to fill the gap. "You were late coming back from break yesterday," one told him once. Bukowski just thought, yeah, and? But he didn't say it. It was like a barking dog. You don't explain to it that it's loud. You just wait for it to shut up. And then there were the night shifts, when the room was nothing but the hum of the neon lights. The air stood still, the dust hung like fine smoke, and every footstep echoed off the walls. Bukowski almost loved those hours because that's when the idiots went quiet. Sometimes he'd sit on a crate, sneak a cigarette, and think about all the conversations he never wanted to have but had to. It was like a theater where everyone knew their role, except him. That's exactly why he wrote them down. There were also those break rooms, smelling of cold coffee and cheap detergent, where the true faces of idiots showed themselves. They'd lean back like kings on their plastic thrones, telling the same stories everyone had heard 100 times before. One claimed to know everything about horse racing but had never won a bet. Another thought he was a philosopher because he owned a wall calendar with quotes on it. Bukowski said nothing. He watched. Every gesture, every grimace, the giggling at the same old joke, all of it went into his mental archive to be bled out onto paper later that night. After such breaks, he often returned to work with a quiet grin, not because the joke was funny, but because he knew he'd twist it later so it would shine in the right light, or glow like a burnt-out filament. That was his way of getting revenge without anyone noticing. He didn't need loud confrontations. One line in a story, a little jab in a poem, that was enough to preserve a scene forever. Some of the men laughing with him back then didn't know they were already half-formed characters in a novel. Some wouldn't have understood it anyway.
Sometimes, after work, he didn't go straight home. He'd turn into one of those bars that smelled by afternoon like they'd never closed. The counter was sticky, the light was dirty yellow, and the bartender always looked like he had a score to settle with the world. There, Bukowski could spit out the whole day like a rotten tooth. He'd sit down, order whiskey, and listen to the regulars swap their wisdoms. They'd talk about sports, women, politics, all with the same confidence, whether they knew what they were talking about or not. He thought, idiots are the true power supply for a writer. Not the scholars, not the intellectuals, but these guys, the ones who love the sound of their own voices. After an hour in a bar like that, he could describe half the room without having spoken a word. The way someone held their body, the nervous twitch of a hand, the laugh that was too loud and too empty. He stored it all in his head. He knew these scenes held more truth than any official biography. And while the others kept talking, he drank quietly, observed, stored. Some thought he was just taciturn, some thought he was rude. In reality, he was working, his kind of work, the kind that looked like laziness from the outside, but filled whole books. There were also nights when he skipped the bar and wandered the streets of Los Angeles instead. The neon light from shop windows threw colorful shadows on the asphalt, and from the open doors of diners came the smell of fried grease. Here, among stray dogs, cheap motels, and honking cars, he sometimes felt freer than in any apartment. No one told him what to do. No one timed his breaks. Just him, his cigarette, and a city full of stories waiting to be written down. Sometimes, after one of those night walks, he'd come home and go straight to the typewriter, keys clacking in rhythm with his thoughts. Outside, the morning was already starting without him noticing. He'd write about the guy in the bar who laughed too loud, the coworker who always stretched his breaks, the woman who left him because he never made anything of himself. He knew this wasn't whining. It was inventory. He cataloged the idiots of the world like a zoologist documenting rare animals. The difference was, they weren't rare. They were everywhere. And they multiplied faster than ideas. Some mornings, after writing through the night, he'd close the machine like he'd just won a fight. Outside, the sky was turning, and somewhere far off, you could hear the first buses. He knew that right now, the idiots were waking up, freshly showered, ready to fill the day with their nonsense. But his work was already done. He'd captured them, preserved them, turned them into something worth more than their words. Literature. That was his quiet revenge, and his quiet victory. There were days he woke up already knowing he had no energy for conversations, no tolerance for the old man on the corner who told everyone how bad politics were, no patience for the neighbor who always asked what you did for a living and then pulled a face when your answer didn't fit his little world. In those moments, Bukowski took the simplest way out. Keep your mouth shut, drink your coffee, disappear. Sometimes, that's the real art. Not having the better line, but having no line at all.
But sometimes when he did speak, it was with a precision that took the air out of the room. One single sentence, sharp as a razor blade, and silence. He had no interest in playing the moralist. He just wanted his peace. But when idiots got too close, when they thought they could drag him into their little theater, he left them a parting line they wouldn't forget. It was his way of setting boundaries without getting his hands dirty. There were nights he took those sharp lines with him to the bar. He'd sit in his corner, drinking slow, and if someone got too pushy, they got the full dose. Not loud, not aggressive, more like a knife placed gently against the skin. Most didn't even notice he'd just cut them to pieces. They were still laughing while he was already drawing on his next cigarette. For Bukowski, it wasn't malice. It was sport. He knew idiots don't disappear, so you might as well have some fun with them before going home. Sometimes he didn't even need idiots for material. Memory was enough. A line from childhood, a scene from an old apartment, the sound of a typewriter in a strange city. He'd lay those memories next to the fresh observations, like old bottles beside new ones. Sometimes the contents mixed. Then something would appear that was neither entirely real nor entirely invented. The stuff his stories thrived on. Some days those memories came back like an old drunk. He'd see himself as a young guy in some shabby room, too little money, too much noise from the neighbors, a typewriter that sometimes got more beer than paper. Back then, he often thought he'd drown, but he didn't. He just kept swimming, head barely above the surface, and he knew the others were doing the same. Only instead of stories, they were producing pure nonsense. Everyone has their craft. For idiots, it's stupidity. Sometimes stuck in those memories, he felt the years folding into each other. The young Bukowski with the empty fridge and the older one with the full bookshelf were basically the same guy, just with more scars and better stories. He'd never tried to avoid idiots. He knew they'd made him who he was. They were the grit in the gears, the thing that kept the machine from running smoothly. And that's exactly why his work sounded so human. He had this quiet realization. Without idiots, life might be easier, but it would also be boring. They provided the friction, the noise you had to write against. Without them, he might have settled into tidy boredom. Steady jobs, rent paid on time, and eventually fading away quietly. But this way he stayed loud, even when he was silent. He wrote against them, not to change them, but to keep from losing himself. And every time he raised a glass, it was also a quiet toast to the fact that they'd just given him more material. There were rare evenings when he was truly satisfied. Not because something great had happened, but because he'd done everything right. He'd written, drunk, laughed, and given the idiots just enough room to expose themselves. That was his balance. He didn't need a big finale or redemption. Just that quiet moment of knowing he'd survived another day without being eaten alive by the world's stupidity. And sometimes, sitting there in his chair with the last sip of whiskey, he'd let his thoughts drift. Back over the years, the jobs he'd hated, the faces he never wanted to see again, and the nights he'd relive if he could. He knew he wouldn't change a thing, even if he had the chance. The idiots, the shifts, the bars, the women, the smoky conversations, all part of the same dirty mosaic. Without a single piece, the picture would be incomplete. He also knew he couldn't go on forever. One day, the body would hand him the bill. Fewer nights in bars, more hours in hospitals. But that was a problem for later. For now, only this mattered. A full ashtray, half a glass, and the knowledge that he'd seen enough today to fill another chapter. The idiots would be there tomorrow, as reliable as sunrise and hangovers. Sometimes the laughter wasn't enough. There were days when even the best line, the deepest drink, and the sharpest observation couldn't untie the knot. On those days, there was only one thing to do. Finish the drink, grab your coat, and leave. Not out of defeat, but out of self-preservation. Because the art of living with idiots is also the art of disappearing before they suck the last bit of sanity out of your bones. And when he left, he did it without drama. No slam doors, no final words that could be thrown back at him later. He just got up, paid, and walked into the night like he'd never been there. He knew the idiots wouldn't understand. They needed conflict. They needed witnesses to feel alive. He just needed quiet. The streets were empty, only the city's low hum in the background. And somewhere in one of those apartments, the next idiot was already waiting to become part of a story. In that moment, he was free. When he closed the door behind him, the city outside was just a distant hum. He set the glass down on the table, pulled the chair close, and reached for the typewriter. Another day, another batch of new idiots, another slice of life to steal from them and make his own. That was his cycle, his rhythm, his twisted kind of peace. He knew that peace was fragile. One phone call, one knock on the door, one random conversation at the wrong time, and you were back in the theater of stupidity. But he had his tools, the pen, the typewriter, the bottle, the cynicism. With those, he could break down any scene, pull it apart, reassemble it. And when it was finally on paper, it was no longer dangerous. The idiots were tamed, packed into sentences. And he knew that circle would always close. New faces, old patterns, the same lines. But as long as he sat outside, on the edge, he could keep going. And maybe that was enough, not to change the world, but not to lose himself. And when he left the bar, it was like stepping from a stuffy room into clear night air. The noise faded, the smell of smoke and beer still clung to his clothes, but his head was clear. The city lay before him like a crooked painting. Neon lights, trashed cans, stray cats, the distant wail of a siren. That was his territory, not the bar, not the workplace. Out here, he could walk wherever he wanted, without anyone telling him how or why. He kept going, step by step, each step a small act of freedom. The city smelled of rain and gasoline, and somewhere a loose metal sheet clattered in the wind. Music he understood. No voices, no lectures, no stupid questions, just the sound of the night walking with him. He turned into a side street where the light was weaker and the shadows longer. Here, away from the main roads, he could be as invisible as he wanted.
He thought about the faces of the evening, the lines that stuck. Some he'd write down tomorrow, others he'd forget on purpose. Not every stupidity was worth preserving. The good ones, the sharp ones, the ones that nailed a person in 3 words. Those he took with him like a thief with stolen goods. He knew eventually he'd get home, close the door behind him, strip it all off like a jacket that was too tight. But until then, he took his time, walking through the empty neighborhood, hearing only his own footsteps and the distant rattle of a train. In those moments, he wasn't a writer or a drinker or an observer, just a man walking home. And that was enough. When he finally turned the key, he knew tomorrow would bring the same stage, the same gestures, the same voices, the same faces. But he also knew he'd have the choice again, to play along or to watch. And most of the time, he chose to watch. Because in the end, he'd learned sometimes the best thing isn't just to laugh. Sometimes you just finish the drink, grab your coat, and walk out.
Thank you for being here. I heard something. I have to leave quickly. See you.